Hello, good evening and welcome to episode 8 of the Crane Report, Humanity versus Insanity. Well, surely it hasn't escaped anyone's attention that basically those who purport to be our elected leaders really don't give a damn about the proletariat. They are there to look after themselves and themselves only. They have very little autonomy, as Gordon Brown found out when he eventually became Prime Minister. And once he realised just how little autonomy, how little authority he had, he was a broken man. That's why he is a shadow of the man we got to know as the Chancellor, when he was still deluded enough to believe that as Prime Minister of the country, he could actually call the shots. Now, those who believe themselves to be the rightful rulers of a planetary fiefdom are getting ever more arrogant. They believe that they have got humanity so dumbed down that they can actually now spell out the agenda and nobody will care, because they've got them to the point of poverty where they have to spend every hour of every day either trying to find a job where they can earn sufficient money to keep a roof over their head and food on the table. Not least is the very recent admission by the Bank of England that money is just an IOU, and the banks are rolling in it. And of course, this is something that many people have tried to explain over the past 100 plus years, ever since the Federal Reserve was established in 1913. But in the UK, we have exactly the same charade here, with the Bank of England, the central bank of the country, literally printing money. It's just an IOU. And as Max Kaiser rightly identifies, the banks don't need the workers anymore. They don't need them to pay taxes, because if the banks just need money, or the government needs money, it will simply be printed. Tonight, we're going to be talking with Roger Hayes, who has been well aware of this for many years and has also realised that every mortgage that's out there, mortgage, death grip, death pledge, every mortgage that's out there is fraudulent. And we'll be talking to Roger a little bit later in the programme about his initiative to establish a class action against the banks. But first of all, let's spend a little bit of time and take a look at the alchemy that is fractional reserve banking. Now, this is a mythology that has been created for the past 100 plus years. In fact, the central bankers made 2 previous attempts to establish a central bank in the US, but each time the senators in the US realized that handing control of the monetary system over to the banks would ultimately lead to bankruptcy, i.e. the banks effectively owning everything, which is pretty much what they do, of course, because the Federal Reserve has the US in hock to the tune of $17.2 trillion. The UK debt isn't quite so great, but the interest is now in excess of £90 billion per year. But let's have a look briefly at how fractional reserve banking really works, because it is alchemical. In fact, it's even more magical than alchemy, because with alchemy, you do at least need a base product, a base metal to start. But with fractional reserve banking, we literally have money from nothing. Money from nothing. All the central bank needs is a mandate from the central government that it has authority to manage the nation's economy. In fact, in the US, the Federal Reserve, when it was established in December of 1913, all opponents, by the way, to the Federal Reserve conveniently going down with the Titanic a year or so previous. So once the Federal Reserve was established, it didn't really have any money, but it created money, and then it lent the fictional money that it had to the US government which the government immediately deposited in the Federal Reserve, and of course was paying interest on this non-existent money right from the get-go. So in our example, here we have the central bank. Now the central bank needs a bit of help, so it needs to create some regional banks. And we're going to give the central bank, in our example, $1 million. Make-believe dollars. All you need is a ledger and a pen or a spreadsheet and a keyboard. Now, the central bank is going to use a fractional calculation here, and it's going to use a fractional reserve ratio of 5:1. So its 1 million of non-existent cash is actually going to be turned into 5 million of non-existent cash. But it needs to do something with that money, so it needs some help from the regional banks. So we're going to call them Bank A, Bank B, Bank C, and Bank D, and Bank E are going to effectively be representations of the high street banks. So let's get the ball rolling here. So the central bank is going to start lending money out. So it's going to use its 5 million, and it's going that it created out of nothing, and it's going to pump out $1 million to each of the regional banks here. But the regional banks are going to use a fractional reserve ratio of 10:1. So their 1 million of non-existent money is going to be multiplied by 10 to create $10 million of non-existent money, which of course they are then going to lend on. But the central bank is also going to pump out money to the high street banks at the rate of $1 million to each. And the regional banks are also going to lend money to the high street banks. And of course, the high street banks all calculate the LIBOR rate, that's the corruption between the banks of calculating exactly who's going to pay whom what interest on nothing. And that interest, of course, has to come from somewhere, which we'll look at in just a second. So even the high street banks, using their fractional reserve ratio of 10:1, they're going to create 20 million from the 2 million, or 30 million from the 3 million and Bank D, and Bank E another 20 million. So what we've got from 1 million non-existent money initially deposited, I use that term very loosely, in the central bank, has now created $70 million down at the street level. But it's still within the banking system. It's got to be put out into the community. And this it does by lending money to governments, to businesses, and to individuals. And of course, all of that money actually has to be repaid. So the reality is that every single pound, dollar, euro that is in circulation, somebody somewhere owes interest on that money. And that interest has to come from somewhere. So where does it come from? Well, it has to come from the national wealth. It can come from productivity, but then even so, ultimately, it has to come from the wealth that already exists within the nation. So what the central banks are looking to have repaid is not just the loan capital, but the loan capital with interest. And in reality, what happens is over the years, the national wealth gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until such time as it's effectively negative. And the reality is that even on maximum productivity within the country cannot generate sufficient national wealth to even repay the interest on the loan. At which point, of course, the debt just gets bigger and bigger, and that black hole is ever increasing in size. And ultimately, of course, the bankers, the banksters, own the country. Just like in Greece and Ireland. Ireland should, of course, be one of the wealthiest nations in the EU, sitting where it does at the western edge of the European Union, with some 23% of EU waters, territorial waters, actually being part of the Irish nation. Yet corrupt Irish politicians sold 19% of that 23% for a one-off payment of 6 billion euros a few years ago. In addition, Ireland is sitting on enormous hydrocarbon resources, both on land in the form of shale gas, much more of that a bit later on tonight in Fracking Nightmare, but also offshore oil and gas in the territorial waters of the Irish nation, which is why the Irish nation was deliberately bankrupted. A process started in 2007, and the architect of this bankruptcy was none other than an Irishman by the name of Peter Sutherland, an arch globalist. And we'll be talking about Peter Sutherland on a future edition of the Crane Report, Humanity versus Insanity. Well, obviously, that money is being put into the community as government loans, as business loans, and as personal loans. And of course, the largest chunk of the personal loans comes as mortgage, the death grip, telling it like it is. And of course, the whole ethos of house ownership in the UK has been effectively burgeoning since Margaret Thatcher encouraged people to own their own property and actually sold debt slavery like never before. Many people, of course, including myself at the time, falling into the trap that home ownership was creating an asset that would stand you in good stead for your entire life. The reality is that increasingly around the country, and particularly as the shale gas industry and the coal bed methane industry kicks off, that asset is going to turn into a major liability. But people say they own their own house, and of course they don't own their own house. They are no more than like the car owner. They are the registered keeper of a property. They are responsible for maintaining that property. But the property is ostensibly owned by the bank. As anybody who, for whatever reason, fails to pay their mortgage for a few months, they will quickly realise that they don't own the property. The bank owns that property. And they own that property on the basis of a loan that was created out of thin air. Now, the media have published this article about the way in which money is created. It's now out there. So although when I was touring Australia a couple of years ago, the Independent newspaper in Australia accused me of being a conspiracy theorist because I stated that the Australian Central Bank was creating money out of thin air. Well, the genie is now out of the bottle. And fortunately, there are people who have sufficient understanding and comprehension of the way this works to actually challenge the banks at their own game. So that's the perfect point at which I can bring Roger Hayes into the discussion. Roger, are you online?
Yes, I am indeed, Ian. Good evening to you. How are you?
I am very well, thank you. And thank you for joining us this evening.
My pleasure.
I hope that you were able to catch that 10-minute rant on fractional reserve banking.
Yes, indeed.
Okay. So, Roger, tell us, what is it that you are developing with this initiative to challenge the banks?
Okay, well, there's two aspects of it. First and foremost, there's the issue that you've raised, of course, which is that the banks are creating money out of nothing, and they are then lending it to us at interest. There's actually nothing wrong with creating money out of nothing. It's about the distribution of that money that's crucial, and it's also the fact that it's attached to interest, which is undermining the economy, as you correctly pointed out. So my contention is that we can go to the courts and we can simply say that the claim that the banks are lending us money is fraudulent, and we can ask that the interest be paid back on the basis that there is misrepresentation and fraud, which is covered by the 2006 Fraud Act.
So when we talk about repayment of interest, I mean, we are talking an enormous sum of money, aren't we? Because if we take a mortgage over say, a 25-year period, and let's just take, I mean, what's the average mortgage in this country now? Probably something in the region of about £100,000, maybe probably even more, actually.
that figure of £100,000 over 25 years at, say, 5% interest, it means that you pay £175,000 back over that 25-year period. And bearing in mind that the banks did not have the money in the first place, they're making a £75,000 profit on the back of the £100,000 supposed loan that they issued or acted as a facilitator of in the first place. So that's not bad business if you can get it, is it?
Well, it's not bad at all, but I mean, as we well know, the banks have an enormous responsibility to pay outrageous bonuses to their employees. So how are they going to be able to pay these enormous bonuses if they don't get money out of nothing back from the mortgagee?
It's not just the bonuses, Ian. Of course, the other thing they've got to consider now is all the fines that they're having to pay for the corrupt activity they're involved in. And I believe that the figure of 40 billion was mentioned as the figure they've allocated for the PPI scandal. My estimate is that the mortgage scandal that we're now looking at will be in the trillions. And surely this will be the straw that breaks the camel's back. I believe that we have got a legitimate claim. Anybody who has been charged interest by the banks on the fraudulent claim that the banks lent money when they simply did not, that claim multiplied by the many, many thousands or hundreds of thousands of mortgages over the past X number of years is going to add up to trillions upon trillions. And as I said, I believe that this will be the straw that breaks the camel's back, and that will lead to a completely new system, new banking system, which is what I've been advocating for many years now, and which is why we've parked in the sidelines the lawful bank, which I believe is there a mechanism by which to instigate a new banking system for and on behalf of the people.
Okay, obviously what you're up against, what we're all up against, is a central bank that effectively now controls the global economy. And what we've seen is the militia of the global banksters, which is effectively the US military. What we have seen over the last few years or so, of course, is the banksters militia effectively invade every country that has found a means of keeping outside of the central banking system. And I think the only countries now that remain outside of the central banking system are effectively Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, Iran, and Russia.
Yes, indeed. I believe, obviously, they were the axis of evil, as mentioned by Bush some years ago.
Indeed, that's absolutely correct. And of course, what we're seeing right now is the attempt to demonize Russia. By the way, I think I forgot to mention Syria. Syria is also, at the moment, outside. But Russia, of course, the economy has been extremely astutely managed by Vladimir Putin over the past, nearly 14 years now, effectively taking national sovereignty back from the World Bank and restoring literally financial independence for the Russian people.
Yeah, and I believe that there's discussions between Russia and China to start to form a new world currency that will not involve the US dollar. So at some point in the future, I believe the US dollar will collapse. That's probably going to bring pound sterling, the euro with it, and we'll see the emergence of a new one world currency. But it won't be the one world currency that the global elite are trying to create. It will be potentially a Chinese and Russian global currency. So I believe there's a bit of infighting or dispute between the certain global powers. But I'm only speculating, of course, but I'm not in the know. And the reality is that you have a problem about our knowledge of all of this because we're not being informed by our leaders. It's very much a top secret there, isn't it?
Well, it is, absolutely. And of course, the banksters, I mean, want World War III. I mean, they were desperate to start World War III last year with Syria as the catalyst. When the people of the UK, in the first instance, on August 29th, of last year. The people of the UK let it be known to the elected leaders that they would not support another illegal war. And of course, Obama had no choice but to effectively follow suit. So here we are again with every effort to use the Ukraine/Crimea crisis to initiate global conflagration. But hopefully, the people across the world are starting to catch on to this scam and resist this, and hopefully, I mean, if the banksters start a war, then basically, hopefully, no one turns up, and they'll have to fight it themselves. But meanwhile, back in the UK, if the global economy, well, I should say when the global economy collapses, obviously there is a tremendous opportunity to initiate a new economy. Based on something along the principles of the Bradbury pound, or of course the US dollar that Kennedy was trying to introduce when, of course, he was assassinated, and that was one of the primary reasons for his assassination, that he was looking to establish a US economy that was effectively outside of the central banking system. So if this occurs in the UK, how would that impact on the vast number of mortgagees that we have in this country?
Well, that's actually going to be very interesting, because if the monetary system collapses, as we anticipate it will do, people are going to lose their jobs. And the net result of that, of course, is that people won't be able to pay their mortgages. It's going to be an interesting dynamic, because as more and more people can't pay their mortgages, are we anticipating that more and more courts will be, bankrupting people, repossessing their homes? And at what point does the pressure grow to the extent where the people literally rebel against the banks and the courts and the government? It's going to be a very interesting dynamic. And I believe that what we're doing at the moment by bringing this class action forward is we're actually waking more and more people up. We're telling them a very simple story, which they can understand, which is that interest on top of mortgages is unlawful, and provably so, and that what's been going on for the last X number of decades and centuries, in fact, has been one enormous scandal and scam perpetrated against the people by the banks, aided and abetted, of course, by the politicians, the politicians supported again by the judiciary. So, it's a very frightening proposition that the power elite must have to consider, that the people are waking up to what's going on. They're going to say, no, we've got groups of people all over the country who are resisting the bailiffs, who are resisting the courts. I myself have been in a number of courts challenging the judiciary, and the reality of the situation is they know that we know, and it's just a matter of them balancing out between them which is going to be the best course of action. Give up now or give up, in due course. And I think they're just waiting for the if you like, the flip of the coin. And I think this class action that we're proposing now is going to do it for us.
So what are the mechanics of the class action? How can people find out more information about the class action? How can people join the class action?
Okay, well, obviously we have previously been on UK column and reported the class action. I'm doing some groundwork now. We're having a meeting in the next couple of weeks with all the Northwest members of the BCG and the Lawful Bank, with a view to building up a network locally here, and then I will be traveling across country with members of BCG and the Lawful Bank to get those people to get the message out there with leaflets. We hope to print some leaflets in the very near future, describing in very simple terms what the claim is, why the banks have committed this fraud, what the fraud is, and how they can actually go online and sign up to the class action and make a contribution towards the funding of a national campaign talking about advertising both in the news media and also obviously the old faithful on the internet. So at the moment the best course of action is to go to either the BCG website, sign up there. That gives us a line of communication with people, and or also sign up to lawfulbank.com. Again, that gives us a line of communication with people, and we can then inform people in the local community. Those are the people who are signed up, and then we're hoping that people will group themselves together and start setting up their own banking system, the local community banking system. That, to me, is the way forward.
But the local community banking system, surely, until such time as the current system falls apart, is going to rely on people depositing money, which cannot then be multiplied using fractional reserve. It would be a one-to-one. So basically, what the bank receives is what it lends out. So how would that bank actually cover its expenses?
Well, I mean, the whole concept of fractional reserve banking, I think we have to understand that what their fractional reserve banking, the reason it's bad is because of the fact that the distribution of money is to their favoured few, and that's the means of making more and more wealth. If you distribute money evenly to business and individuals, for example, you could issue mortgages to families interest-free for a period of 50 years and literally creating that money out of nothing. There's nothing wrong with that. The principle being that if you issue money, there must be a way of clawing it back, and that's where the government should play a part by attaching to it a nominal transfer tax. And to give you an example, if the government spent £100 into circulation and charged 1%, then by the time that £100 has been spent 100 times, the tax of 1% brings it back or claws it back out of circulation, at which point it can be respent. So fractional reserve banking or issuing money out of nothing is not the problem. The problem is, as you pointed out, is the interest on top. That is basically a skimming technique that the banks use, and that skimming effectively brings the £100 down to nothing, but not back to government. It goes to the banks. So we're proposing a system whereby issuing money into circulation interest-free is the way forward. Nothing wrong with that at all, but it must be distributed to communities, to infrastructure, to businesses, subject to those businesses paying a fee for the use of the money. That's where the bank overheads are covered, so everything is issued, all money is issued subject to a fee, but primarily the interest not being charged on the capital sum is the way in which the whole system would be balanced.
Well, and I'm sure that some people watching may say, oh my gosh, that's all very well, but that's pure fantasy. It's not going to happen in reality. But interestingly enough, of course, there is one state in the US that actually has used exactly the system that you have described since 1922. So should we play a game here? Do I test your knowledge? Do you know which state that is, Roger?
Delaware?
Ah, good guess, but wrong.
Okay.
It's North Dakota.
Dakota.
North Dakota, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, North Dakota. And back in the early days of the Federal Reserve, the then governor of North Dakota was astute enough to realize that extrapolating the system forward would and could only lead to total bankruptcy. And so he fought for 5 years to get North Dakota out of the Federal Reserve. And eventually, I think the Federal Reserve just decided that he was being such a pain in the proverbial butt that, North Dakota was so small. I mean, it's not small in terms of area. It's actually 40% larger than England in area. But the population back then was very, very small. And it was mainly Norse farmers. In fact, the nickname for North Dakota in the US is North Dakota, because it's primarily Scandinavian farmers who emigrated to the US and then set up their agricultural business. But since 1922, the currency issued in North Dakota is issued by the Bank of North Dakota. It is lent out to businesses. And all businesses in North Dakota are required to bank with the Bank of North Dakota. So it effectively operates as a cooperative bank. And consequently, here we are in 2014, and North Dakota in the US is the only state in the US that isn't bankrupt. This is a model that Iceland attempted to adopt in the aftermath of their crash, with some degree of success. But unfortunately, the World Bank and the IMF, of course, manipulated the Icelandic model. And so unfortunately Iceland is, although on the road to recovery, it's still unfortunately beholden to the IMF. And whereas North Dakota is totally free and clear of the Federal Reserve. So this isn't fantasy. I mean, this is something that can be established, but obviously the banksters, the global banksters, aren't going to just roll over and let this happen. So what's your thought, what's your prognosis on how basically we're going to change this system?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. North Dakota, of course, the thing about North Dakota is they still add interest to the loans. And I believe,
exactly, yeah, they do, yes.
Yeah, I believe that the solution to the problem is that those loans should be issued free of interest, but with a fee. There is nothing, there's no reason that we can't do it in the UK, and that of course is the principle of the lawful bank, is to get enough people signed up to an alternative monetary system that we can actually do that. And I believe that we can use the exchange of sterling initially for our currency, which we've called the sovereignties at the moment. And by that straight exchange, you're effectively backing sovereignties with pound sterling, which would be good for the initial period, but eventually sovereignties could be a standalone currency. We could issue it into circulation, and the only thing that would be stopping us is its acceptance in the communities and around the United Kingdom. So in principle, we have got to educate people into using a parallel currency, a bit like sort of going into a retail shop and buying something, for example, for £100 and say paying 90% in pound sterling and then 10% in sovereignties. That would get people using the sovereignties and used to sovereignties. And there's a number of ways that can be done. It can be done with either cash or it can be done with cards. And the work I've been doing is setting up a system of cards, a banking system, and so on and so forth. And we're not that far away from launching it. These things do take time. And the work I've been doing, as I say, has been fine-tuning and getting to the point where we can confidently say we now have a banking system that people can use voluntarily, and they can use it alongside pound sterling. And then when pound sterling collapses, as surely it will, we will then have a currency free of debt that people can use in lieu of pound sterling.
Now, and I think that actually, you know what, people will embrace it. I think they will seriously embrace it, especially if they can see, like the people of Iceland saw. I mean, they went through horrendous trauma, of course, when the economy collapsed. Or was it 2008? And it took them some time, obviously, to get over this national shock. But one of the great things that happened, of course, was that the people pulled together. They realized that their elected leaders and their bankers had seriously let them down. That's what happens when you let fishermen become bankers. But it seriously let them down. They destroyed the economy, destroyed their lifestyle, which of course was built on smoke and mirrors. And then once they got over the shock, all started to pull together. And so today, I mean, the Icelandic economy, whilst not perhaps quite as buoyant as it was in the false boom years, but nonetheless, it's being built on very solid foundations.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the point is that the Icelandic people understood the principle, that their leaders were corrupt. They were just supporting the bankers, and good on them. And I think that's what we've got to do here. But we're not there yet. We've still got to do a little bit of homework with regards to educating people, getting to the point of understanding what it's all about. And I don't know how many people in the United Kingdom understand the system. I do know there's a lot of people. I would guess at maybe 5%, but we need that to be more like 25% before something's really going to happen in the United Kingdom.
That's true, but and I would absolutely concur with you. In fact, when I first started broaching the issue of the imminence of a collapse, which was around about 2006, And back then, if you mentioned the phrase fractional reserve banking, I mean, people's eyes glazed over. They had no clue what you were talking about. And what's interesting, of course, is if you go into your bank today and just walk up to the counter and say, excuse me, could you explain fractional reserve banking to me? In most cases, what you're going to find is that the person sitting behind the counter is not going to have the first clue of what you're talking about, because the people who work in the banks aren't taught the principle of fractional reserve banking, because otherwise they might realize they're effectively working for a fraudulent organization. But since obviously the crash, I mean, the property market in this country started to go into decline in October 2007, October 15th, 2007 to be precise. And then, of course, the full force of the collapse really kicked in 2008. And over the last 5.5 years, the number of people who now have at least a rudimentary understanding of fractional reserve banking is quite considerable. I mean, whether it's 10 or 20% or whatever, but it's certainly a hell of a lot more than it was back in 2006. And of course, it's going to grow exponentially. And I think that especially when the US dollar collapses, and it's teetering, I mean, there is no question that the US dollar is collapsing. And I got to say that, you know, it may seem a bit random, but I'm also very interested and watching very closely what is happening with the Israeli embassies, because as I'm sure many people are aware, Israel has effectively, the Israeli foreign ministry has effectively closed all its embassies around the world. And this is really quite a strange course of action. It's supposedly about a strike over pay, but it seems a bit extreme. And for Israel to be doing something of this ilk and recalling a lot of people back home, I can't help but wonder if they actually know that something is about to break. And they're just taking their people away. Who knows? I mean, I'm not suggesting that I have any special insight whatsoever, but I'm you know, very well aware from past experience that when Israel takes an action like this, it's not normally one-dimensional.
No. Well, we don't know, of course, as you say, there's a lot of speculation on our part, but interestingly enough, over the years, we so-called conspiracy theorists have got it right, haven't we? So the reality is we're the realists, and the mainstream media are the conspiracy theorists, because they keep getting it wrong. So, yeah, you might be right, Ian. I don't know, and I wouldn't hazard a guess. All I do know is that fundamentally the economic system, the world monetary system, cannot continue the way it's going. It's riddled with debt. It's endemic. It has to collapse. Even the American administration have said that they will pull the pound and move on to a new system. So we know it's going to happen. We just don't know when. It's their ability to pull the money out of circulation that will collapse the economy. And I don't know whether you were aware of the comments made by Christine Lagarde at International Monetary Fund. She said that they were predicting that the world economy was going to grow by some 2-point-something% over the next few years. At the same time, she was saying that the banks were going to improve their book balances. In other words, the only way they could do that was
take money out of the system.
Take money out of the system. So she's predicting something which seems to be entirely contradictory. So I believe what she's actually suggesting is this, that around the world they've got in place provision where if there is a systemic collapse of the banking system, the banks have the right to secure for themselves, if you like, their customers' deposits. I believe what's going to happen is they're going to confiscate customers' deposits, convert them into stock, and use that to actually lend out to businesses around the world. So it does two things. One, it does expand the world economy, but it also rectifies the problem the banks have with their book balances, but at the cost of the depositors, who will effectively see their cash converted to useless stock in useless banks. So that's what I believe that's going on there.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, and I'm sure many people who attended my meltdown talks a few years ago will recall that I made the observation that the only thing that you should have in the bank is an overdraft, because anything else that you have in the bank is effectively at risk.
I mean, there's another thing that came out in recent times, which I find very difficult to believe, but they were saying that the average debt was owed was about £3,000. Well, I find that extraordinary. But again, these are the figures that are put out by the mainstream media, and you simply can't trust them. Everybody I talk to, they seem to be up to the eyes in debt, struggling to pay their bills, struggling to pay the mortgage, basically struggling full stop. They're not getting paid enough. Everything seems to be going up in price. The government is talking about inflation of 2%. And I bought a loaf of bread the other day, and it cost me £1.35. Maybe that's a bit more expensive than your average loaf price. But I can recall just a few years, it was about 60 or 70 pence. That is not 2% inflation. They are most definitely lying about the inflation rate. And they're using those lies to suggest that pay increases of more than 1% is not justified. Well, of course, it is justified. So that whole wage inflation argument is once again an example of where they fraudulently put figures out, and you know, the average Joe Soap knows there's something not right, but unfortunately, a lot of them actually do believe what the government say.
Well, the reality is that the average Joe Soap knows that he or she is in debt, and as you rightly say, up to their eyeballs. And the reality is, so is everyone else. But the media just spins it that, no, it's only you. It's only you. Everyone else is able to survive in this economy. It's only you. There must be something wrong with you. And this is what we're seeing in the media, the demonization of basically anybody who, for whatever reason, is not able to function in their corrupt society. And this is a graphic that is a cartoon, actually, that I saw recently. The top 1% controls 46% of the world's wealth. I've actually seen a statistic where it suggests that it's actually even higher than 46%. And of course, this isn't about greed. You know, some people think this is just purely about monetary greed. It's not greed, because these socio-psychopaths can print all the money they want. They don't need to be greedy in that respect. It's about power. It's about power, and it's about control. And it is absolutely essential that people wake up to the fact that your government doesn't give a damn about you, and in fact is going to continue to screw you into the ground. And look at the number of people that are not only unemployed, but then people who have 0 hours contracts, which effectively means that they're not strictly classified as unemployed, but in reality, of course, they are. This is more manipulation of the statistics. The reality is that everyone you know, or the vast majority of people you know, is experiencing hardship and actually doesn't see a way of getting out of it in the existing paradigm. Something has to give. And somewhere along the line, the people of this country have to come together and recognize that the existing political paradigm is not exactly working in their best interests. Now, Roger, you're going to be one of our speakers at the AV5 event in Staverton in mid-May. And, of course, this is going to be an event which is geared to bringing about change. It's not going to be your average conference. This is an event that is drawing together people who are serious about going into their communities and stimulating change. Exactly the type of people that this government doesn't want to see attending this type of event. This is going to be a weekend of like-minded people who are going to do everything they possibly can to ensure that the legacy that we leave future generations is not based on debt. Meanwhile, thank you for joining us this evening. And thank you, Roger, for coming on the show this evening, and looking forward to seeing your presentation at AV5. And that's all from me this evening on Humanity versus Insanity. Join me in 45 minutes for Fracking Nightmare.